the kind of recipe for success that a soft drink company might guard with fierce vigilance, the movie company puts online for all to see. Emma Coates, the former storyboard artist at Pixar, sent out a list of the company's 22 rules of storytelling. I confess, I thought there was just one whatever works, though it's no surprise to learn that Pixar, a Disney subsidiary, has codified its process to a programmatic uniformity. Some of the rules are psychological exercises that don't relate to composition but to a writer's self-knowledge. 10. Pull apart the stories you like. What you like in them is a part of you. You've got to recognize it before you can use it. 20. Exercise. Take the building blocks of a movie you dislike. How do you rearrange them into what you do like? Others have to do with practical aspects of writing and have no apparent impact on results. 11. Putting it on paper lets you start fixing it. If it stays in your head, the perfect idea, you'll never share it with anyone. 17. No work is ever wasted. If it's not working, let go and move on. It'll come back around to be useful later. And some are utter hucksterism, intended to start the writer off with premises so bland that the results would have to be, well, a Pixar movie. 1. You admire the character for trying more than for their successes. 16. What are the stakes? Give us reason to root for the character. What happens if they don't succeed? Stack the odds against. Pixar films make me feel as if I were watching the cinematic equivalent of irresistibly processed food, with a ramped up and carefully calibrated dosing of the emotional versions of salt, sugar, and fat. But the fulsome orthodoxy of the 22 rules goes far beyond the single company's flavor spectrum to a crisis that is endemic to the modern cinema. That is, in fact, one of the strange, unintended consequences of cinematic modernity, the very notion of storytelling and the obsession with characters and whether they're admirable or likable. I've gone down this road before, suggesting that the story is the equivalent of a musical melody or an architectural framework, a basis, not a goal, an element that may either be charmingly memorable or ingeniously conceived, but that is merely a starting point for a significant work, not a result. And just as the marketing of a variety of processed foods turns the ostensible food stuff into a delivery system for its additives, the story processing that the Pixar list outlines turns movies into a delivery system for a uniform set of emotional juicings, and the result, whether for CGI or for live-action films, is a sort of cyborg cinema, a prefabricated simulacrum of experience and emotion that feels like the nexus of pornography and propaganda. The paradox, however, is that the most appalling examples at hand aren't those of the ostensible purveyors of cinematic fast food. They're those of the sludgy middle ground of earnest dramas and so-called art films, whether produced here or in other countries. And the first sign, although in no way a definitive one, is in the credit. Written and directed by. One of the best things accomplished in classic Hollywood was the separating of the work of the screenwriter from that of the director, although some, such as Orson Welles and Joseph Mankiewicz, were equally adept in both realms, and although, credits be damned, the strong directors inevitably had a strong hand in making or changing or discarding the script. And it wasn't just Hollywood. Many of the classic works from the age of Italian neorealism, such as Open City, Bicycle Thieves, and Chronicle of a Love Affair, had many cooks on the screenplay broth. The result was to bring multiple perspectives into play, to create as if journalistically an ample world of incident on which the movie would be based and to which the director could then respond as immediately and as critically as if to the world itself. The problem with many, again, far from all writer-directors, is the sense that they devote more time, energy, emotional involvement, and free thought to the creation of the script than to the direction of the film, which, so often, comes off as the mere enactment and illustration of that script. It may be plain that I'm writing in endorsement of the art of the director, the so-called auteur, but that's where the paradox comes in. One of the seminal texts of the Politique des Auteurs is by François Truffaut, the 1954 critical essay A Certain Tendency of the French Cinema, and, after his rant against several of the most prominent figures of the French movie industry at the time, he puts forth his brief honor roll: Jean Renoir, Robert Bresson, Jean Cocteau, Jacques Beccard, Abel Gance, Max Ophuls, Jacques Tati, Roger Lienhard. These are, nevertheless, French cineasts, and it happens, curious coincidence, that they are auteurs, authors who often write their dialogue and some of them themselves invent the stories they direct. And so it has happened, The age of the auteur has long been in full swing. The director is the acknowledged champion of cinematic art, but the script is nonetheless often the dominant factor in the on-screen results, all the more so, all too frequently, in independent or low-budget filmmaking. One reason is purely practical. The writing and revision of a script are virtually cost-free, so aspiring and struggling filmmakers have the most incentive to polish and rework it when that's the object on which potential financiers are being asked to bet. Often, years are spent developing and refining a script which is then shot in weeks. The problem isn't that the speed of direction kills it can make for a thrilling spontaneity and immediacy, but that, when the script has been built with such solidity and has become an object of obsession for a year or more, it becomes not the springboard for filmmaking but its objective, and constrains the filmmaker to be its illustrator, which is exactly the feeling conveyed by many films. The very transition of screenwriters to direction often signifies the desire to protect one's own script rather than to have at it again with the sort of creative destruction with which strong filmmakers approach a script. Just as the processed food industries have refined their techniques over the years, so have the studios, and that's why, despite the current golden age of cinematic idiosyncrasy, the gap between studio and independent productions, including big-budget ones with Hollywood-tested directors and actors, becomes ever greater. The genius of Steven Spielberg, and I say this with no irony intended, is in his ability to grow processed food in his own garden and to do it with love. As we moderns become more isolated, more occupied with our virtual lives, more distracted by a greater flow of information and stimulation, the emotional comfort food that the rules provide and the illusion of human connection by way of stories become all the more alluring. And that's why, in the age of the internet, the success of TV series is self-perpetuating. The plethora of online discussion they spark drives viewers further into online isolation and makes them all the hungrier for contact with characters and their stories. This is no diatribe against media, the internet, or modernity, but a note on a flattening bell curve, a rise in extremes. The story spew that constitutes so much of the cinematic churn, as well as the episodic series, in other words, audiovisual creation in which the audiovisual is a means, not an end, is matched by a wider and wilder range of invention that, nonetheless, bears the burden of its belatedness and brings an inescapable air of loss and untimeliness to its most forward-looking creations. And here's why. The spirit of free-floating and primally visual cinematic invention comes from the past, as seen in this exquisitely revealing moment from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Love of the Last Tycoon, in which the visionary producer Munro Starr is schooling the British novelist in the art of screenwriting. Suppose you're in your office. You've been fighting duels or writing all day and you're too tired to fight or write anymore. You're sitting there staring dull, like we all get sometimes. The pretty stenographer that you've seen before comes into the room and you watch her idly. She doesn't see you, though you're very close to her. She takes off her gloves, opens her purse and dumps it out on a table. Starr stood up, tossing his keyring on his desk. She has 2 dimes and a nickel and cardboard matchbox. She leaves the nickel on the desk, puts the 2 dimes back into her purse and takes her black gloves to the stove, opens it and puts them inside. There is 1 match in the matchbox and she starts to light it kneeling by the stove. You notice that there's a stiff wind blowing in the window, but just then your telephone rings. The girl picks it up, says hello, listens and says deliberately into the phone, "I've never owned a pair of black gloves in my life." She hangs up, kneels by the stove again, and just as she lights the match you glance around very suddenly and see that there's another man in the office, watching every move the girl makes. Starr paused. He picked up his keys and put them in his pocket. "Go on," said Boxley, smiling. "What happens?" "I don't know," said Starr. "I was just making pictures." When people were crowded with people, and life was teeming with immediate, maybe oppressive, contact, whether in small-town moral surveillance or in urban family tumult, the pictures, not, metaphorically, movies overall, but the images themselves, provided a kind of imaginative escape, blasted open the realm of imagination and fantasy that was, though collective in access, weirdly and fiercely personal in effect. It was the public invention of a new kind of privacy, a new kind of inwardness. Now, the proliferation of stories is the very sign of collective isolation, the obsessive fascination with characters a mark of frustration of contact. But it's also a mark of democracy at work, the retrograde aesthetic that signifies, and maybe even promotes, a form of social progress.